Hey guys, tonight we're going to reveal a dark secret of the English monarchy. What if I told you that the death of King William III wasn't a simple tragedy, but a perfectly orchestrated play? Could a king really be brought down by a small molehill, or was that just a story fabricated to conceal a more horrifying truth? There are whispers that in his final days, he was no longer a king, but merely a puppet being controlled, a shadow replaced by those who wished to hide the truth. This is a story about a corrupted dynasty, a tormented body, and a death that those closest to him turned into a political weapon. We will explore together what truly happened inside the locked rooms of Kensington Palace, and who was the one that wrote the ending for this king. This story isn't just history, it's a conspiracy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please comment below and let me know where you are and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. William III, often called William of Orange, was born in the year 1650 amid a storm of grief and uncertainty. His father, William II, lay dying of smallpox the very moment his newborn son drew breath, leaving the infant prince an orphan from the first gasp of life. His mother, Princess Mary of Modena, herself a figure of poise and sorrow, would raise him in the shadow of loss. His grandparents, Charles I of England and Henrietta Maria of France on one side, and the House of Orange's stalwart defenders on the other, cast long, hopeful eyes upon him. He had no surviving brothers, and his sister, Princess Maria, became both confidante and cautionary tale as childhood hardships tested their tiny frames. From the earliest days, William's health was frail. Asthma assaulted him without warning, and sickness claimed season after season, so that physicians whispered he might not survive his youth. His body remained slender, almost gaunt, with cheeks pale enough to seem translucent by torchlight. Yet within that frail exterior burned an iron will. Each cough, each wheezing breath, stoked in him a determination to endure, to transform suffering into resolve. Where others might have surrendered to weakness, he learned instead to hide his pain behind a steady gaze, to endure indignities with quiet dignity, and to grow stronger in spirit even as his flesh grew thinner. By the time he reached the age of 38, William had accumulated both scars and triumphs. In the year 1689, after a lifetime of exile and plotting, he crossed the English Channel at the head of a fleet of 500 ships and 15,000 soldiers. Under tumultuous skies, battling gales and the weight of 2 crowns, he deposed his Catholic uncle, James II of England, in what would become known as the Glorious Revolution. For the people, it was a miraculous victory, a divine wind that swept tyranny aside. For William, it was simply a duty, an obligation born of conviction, and his unbreakable will to claim the throne he believed rightfully his. He was crowned jointly with his wife, Mary II, a union designed to legitimize his claim, yet marred by distance and sorrow. Their marriage, arranged for stability, was fraught with tension. Mary, the daughter of the very king he had ousted, carried her own burdens of loss and suspicion. Still, they ruled together, their joint reign lasting 13 years, a period marked by significant achievements for the kingdom. William championed the Protestant cause across Europe, forging alliances that checked the ambitions of Louis XIV of France and secured religious freedoms at home. Under his rule, the Bill of Rights of 1689 cemented the principle that monarchs ruled by consent of Parliament, setting the foundations for a constitutional monarchy that would guide England for centuries. Yet behind these successes lay flaws and failures as stark as any fault line. His relentless campaigns and the endless demands of governance took a harsh toll on his already fragile lungs. He coughed until blood stained his handkerchief. The gout that twisted his joints grew more vicious each winter. Though his appetite dwindled, his pride would not allow him to rest. He refused the respite his doctors pleaded for, believing that yielding to infirmity was tantamount to admitting that flesh and blood could defeat a king. In private, those closest to him watched with mounting dread as his once steady hand trembled over state papers, and his speech slurred into a soft Dutch murmur. Yet to the court he remained a symbol of resolve. Letters were forged, portraits doctored, and body doubles employed to mask his decline. As the years passed, The burdens of two kingdoms weighed ever more heavily upon his slender frame. Kensington Palace became both sanctuary and prison, its tapestries unable to staunch the damp that worsened his asthma. Candles burned low to spare his fevered skin, and yew-smoke incense drifted through corridors like whispers of death. His final vice-regal appearance on horseback in early 1702 ended not in triumph, but in tragedy. A stumble over a molehill shattered his collarbone, opening the door to infection that his ravaged body could no longer fight. William III's legacy is thus a tapestry of light and shadow. He transformed England's governance, defended Protestant Europe, and redefined the monarchy's power, but he did so at the expense of his own health and comfort. His reign of 13 years reshaped the kingdom's future, though it left in its wake the haunting image of a king who would not bow to the frailty of flesh. And so, as you drift into slumber, remember that even the mightiest ruler born amid loss, tempered by suffering, and crowned through valor, must one day answer to the quiet, unyielding demands of mortal flesh. The marriage of William III to Mary II, daughter of James II, was not born of romance, but of regal calculation. Mary, born in the year 1662 in London, was the younger sister of Anne, the future queen. Her mother, Mary of Modena, a princess from the Italian Duchy of Modena, brought with her a legacy of continental sophistication, but also the stigma of Catholic faith in a Protestant realm. William, born in 1650, was already heir to the House of Orange-Nassau, his father William II's death by smallpox, leaving him ruler of the Principality of Orange and a claimant in the tangled succession of England, Scotland and Ireland. Their union in 1689 served to unite two dynasties, Protestant and Dutch, forging a bulwark against the ambitions of Louis XIV of France. Yet beneath the pageantry lay a gulf of suspicion and solitude. Mary, ever mindful of her father James's overthrow, viewed William's exile and homecoming with caution, while William, carrying the scars of chronic illness and political exile, found companionship elusive. Their conversations centered on treaties and religious settlement rather than personal hearts, and the bridal chamber often felt more like a council chamber. Within the ornate scaffoldings of Street, James's chapel, the couple's vows echoed like solemn decrees, to uphold the Protestant faith, to rule jointly over England, Scotland and Ireland, and to defer to Parliament's authority. In practice, Mary remained a measured partner, seldom venturing beyond the strictures of royal protocol. William, for all his martial vigour, found court life stifling. Each public appearance required him to parade policies while suppressing his laboured breathing and the pallor of his skin. Courtiers gossiped of nights when they heard Mary's soft sobbing behind closed doors, and of mornings when William appeared in state robes smeared with last night's sweat. Despite their royal titles, they retreated from intimacy into the solitude of duty. Then, in the chill of February 1694, Mary fell victim to smallpox, the furtive scourge of palaces and peasantry alike. William, roused from a fitful rest at Kensington Palace, hastened to her bedside. Witnesses later painted the scene in muted hues of grief, lamplight trembling on Mary's fevered brow, William's trembling hands clasped around hers, and tears coursing down his gaunt cheeks. For the first time, the vaunted king, who had commanded armies before dawn, wept openly. He knelt on the plush carpets of the Queen's chamber, his crimson cloak pooled around him, and the hush of night was rent by his sobs. In that moment, the armour of state gave way to raw humanity. The death of Mary fractured William's heart, and set him adrift in a sea of mourning that no counsel or prayer could calm. In the days that followed, William's health, always precarious, declined precipitously. Asthma, his lifelong adversary, roared back with fresh cruelty. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Gout, that sly tormentor, crept into his ankles and knees, twisting every step into agony. Fever stole the warmth from his limbs, leaving his skin clammy and pallid. His eyes, once sharp with command, grew glazed and unfocused. Sleep, once a precious balm, became a battleground. Every gasp a duel with death. Every turn in the silken sheets an invitation for a coughing fit. Courtiers whispered that the king no longer retired to rest, but to wrestle with his own mortality. His personal physician, Dr. Thomas Gibson, recorded temperatures and pulse in secret ledgers, the ink smudged by feverish sweats, while senior lords signalled for body doubles to appear at public ceremonies in William's stead. Under the flicker of guttering candles in the royal apartments, William struggled to maintain the illusion of vigour. At council meetings, his empty seat draped in royal cloth became the symbol of a throne upheld by rumour and subterfuge. Foreign ambassadors received letters stamped with his seal, proclaiming his swift recovery, though scholars noted the handwriting trembled like a leaf in the wind. The high altar at Whitehall heard prayers for his restoration, even as the courtiers readied preparations for life without a monarch. Servants laid out state gowns beside beds comprising straw and velvet. The stench of poultices, mixtures of lavender and leech ointment, filled the corridors, and the echo of shuffling steps replaced the triumphant fanfares of earlier years. William, once the fearless general who led cavalry charges in November storms, now leaned on walls and walking sticks, his crown slightly askew, his sceptre a burden. In this spectral court, the green flag of the Prince of Orange flew from the towers, but the winds of fortune had turned. Political unions frayed as Parliament, emboldened by the King's infirmity, pressed for greater influence. Debates in the Commons grew heated. Should a regency be declared? Might the King's incapacity warrant a caretaker government? Whispers of the glorious revolution lost their lustre as the revolution's architect lay weakened by illness and solitude. Meanwhile, William's own mind, battered by pain and isolation, began to betray him in small ways. The occasional mispronunciation in Dutch, a refusal to sign documents he once penned with authority, and letters left unfinished on the desk, the quill abandoned mid-sentence. And yet, William refused to surrender. Even as his breath faltered, he surfaced for weekly levees, leaning heavily on aides to rise from cushioned thrones. He presided over Privy Council meetings, his voice husky yet resolute, declaring that England's liberties must not diminish with his failing strength. He championed new laws, strengthening the Bank of England, reorganising naval defences, and promoting religious tolerance for Protestant dissenters, each act a testament to a mind still focused on the realm's welfare. Those who watched him that final spring saw not a broken man but a sovereign forging on, a flicker of ember shining through a winter's chill. Yet every step William took toward the public eye cost him dearly. The gout in his joints flared into agony. The asthma constricted his chest until each word was a triumph over suffocation. Each night, the pale moon cast long shadows over Kensington's gardens, and courtiers feared that one last carriage ride or public reading would be his undoing. William, ever steadfast, met them with a gentle nod, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and an unspoken farewell. He would not let the kingdom crumble in his twilight hours. He would not yield until he drew his final breath. In that hush between reign and remembrance, William III's marriage to Mary, his battles with illness, and his unwillingness to relinquish the crown became intertwined. The union meant to unify two dynasties ended in solitude. The companion he mourned became the memory he carried into weakened days. On state occasions he stood alone, draped in regal attire, a living monument to the paradox of power, that the mightiest of men can be brought low by the smallest of ailments. And so, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that lonely figure standing before the throne, sceptre in hand, breathing each hesitant breath, as though it were both a prayer and a proclamation that even a king must one day surrender to the quiet inevitability of human frailty. By the month of February, in the year 1702, William III's body had been reduced almost to a whisper of flesh and bone, yet he remained determined to mount his horse and breathe the cold air of early spring. He claimed that inhaling the frosty breeze would remind him he was still king, that every rasping inhalation affirmed his purpose and worth. So on a grey morning, when frost still jewelled the grass of Hampton Court's meadows, he requested Sorrel, his beloved sorrel-coloured mare. The stewards bundled him into his riding cloak, and with slow ceremony he was hoisted into the saddle. Courtiers watched with polite masks of concern as William urged Sorrel forward into the dew-damp pasture. No one noticed the seemingly innocuous molehill, a simple mound raised by a blind creature burrowing in winter, until Sorrel's hoof caught its edge. In a slow, heart-stopping moment, the horse pitched forward, and William fell with a crack that echoed through the cold air. He struck the ground upon his shoulder, fracturing his collarbone in two jagged halves. To any healthy man, such an injury might be painful but survivable. To William, whose immune defences had been eroded by decades of asthma, gout, fevers, and relentless duty, it became the portal to mortality. The skin around the wound darkened within hours, and small crimson lines of infection spread inward from the fracture site. Within days, William was delirious with fever. His cough, once an intermittent nuisance, turned into a cruel convulsion that shook his frame until he vomited putrid phlegm streaked with blood. Dr. Thomas Gibson, the king's most trusted physician, and his colleagues resorted to every learned remedy of the age. Poultices of crushed sage and willow bark, leeching to balance the humours, cupping to draw out the poison, and even cautious acupuncture each procedure pursued in whispered urgency. They whispered assurances that His Majesty will recover if he remains resolute, yet in their eyes flickered a candle of doubt. Their instruments lay clinking on silver trays, filled with bandages saturated in herbal salves. But none of their arts could staunch the relentless tide of infection. Meanwhile, within the dank confines of what courtiers called the Blue Room at Kensington Palace, the atmosphere turned suffocating. Thick velvet drapes, once royal hues of azure and gold, now drooped like mourning veils, their pile heavy with mould. Candles were kept low, lest heat aggravate the king's feverish skin, and the only light came in ghostly flickers that cast long, trembling shadows. The air carried the sour tang of decaying poultices and the metallic sting of congealing blood. Linen sheets lay stained and scented with medicinal herbs and the bitter musk of sweat. Servants tiptoed with voiceless dread, as if any echo might rouse the sovereign to his last breath. Outside that chamber of shadow and sickness, William's court churned with artifice. The first act of concealment was the use of body doubles, gentlemen of similar stature and carriage, trained to mimic the king's measured gait and formal gestures. They surfaced on balconies and at gatehouse ceremonies, raising gloved hands to the crowd, lending credence to rumours of His Majesty's convalescence. Meanwhile, missives bearing William's seal and signature were penned with a steady hand that no longer belonged to him, dispatched to foreign courts announcing his improved health and forthcoming audience. Ambassadors, long accustomed to deference, accepted these dispatches with bowed heads, though some remarked upon the tremor in the handwriting and the staleness of the phrases. Yet the crowning illusion, this carefully woven masquerade, could not entirely mask the sovereign's decline. In the hallways, attendants paused outside the Blue Room to catch his laboured wheeze, a sound more mournful than any lamentation. It was the final refrain of a once vigorous legend, now succumbing to the inevitability of flesh and bone. The very stones of Kensington Palace seemed to absorb the sound, echoing each ragged breath through silent corridors. And in the stillness, courtiers realised that no tapestry, no forged document, no elegantly turned phrase could stem the final tide. The king's body, worn thin by years of battle, both political and personal, was at last succumbing to the small breach a single fall had inflicted. As night deepened and the world outside lay hushed under a pale moon, the Blue Room remained lit by a solitary lamp. Inside, William III lay draped in velvet and shadow, each shallow breath a testament to his unyielding spirit. He had ruled lands from London to Holland, repelled invasions, secured religious freedoms, and yet here he lay conquered by the subtlest of foes. Infection from a broken bone. And though the court continued its rituals, the signing of decrees in his name, the assurances of his recovery, the faint rasp of his breath endured, a reminder that even the mightiest must one day surrender to the quiet dominion of mortality. Throughout his final days, William III dwelled in a realm of fevered delirium and profound isolation. He called out for Mary, his queen, who had slipped from this world 8 years earlier, his voice echoing through the dim corridors as if he expected her to appear at his side. In moments of wakeful madness, he roused himself from fitful slumber, only to marshal phantom armies. "Forward, musketeers!" he would cry, propping himself against damp pillows, eyes glazed upon invisible lines of battle. His commands, hoarse with suffering, filled the room like the distant roll of drums, though no soldier stirred beyond the thresholds. Beneath his door, Lord Portland, his oldest friend and confidant, sat vigilant, a silent sentinel in velvet livery, fearing that each rasping inhalation might be the sovereign's final breath. Down in the dank recesses of Kensington Palace's underground chambers, known in hushed tones as the Blue Room, The atmosphere had shifted from political intrigue to the sombre cadence of illness. The tapestry of royal blue, once resplendent, hung heavy with mildew, and the velvet curtains clung to the stone walls in drooping folds. A meagre fire burned in the hearth, its embers glowing faintly to avoid overheating the king's fevered skin. Each flicker of flame seemed an uneasy truce with the cold that seeped into William's bones. There were no afternoons of state council anymore, no debates on matters of succession or alliance, only the ceaseless drip of herbal infusions, the soft rustle of bandages, and Dr. Thomas Gibson's measured notes. Gibson, sworn to discretion, kept a meticulous journal of William's decline. He recorded every pulse, once strong enough to boom through the chamber like a drumbeat of authority, now fluttering and weak. He noted the swelling at the fractured collarbone, an angry purple blot against the king's thin flesh, and the small black pustules that surfaced along the wound's edge. Each day brought a fresh cluster of pustules, lanes of infection winding inward. The king's cough produced globs of frothy, blood-streaked phlegm that Gibson gingerly collected in silver cups. William's hands, once firm on the reins of sorrel and the hilt of his sword, now curled into bony claws, knuckles white with tension. His body, stripped of its royal trappings, lay gaunt and brittle as winter branches, every breath a laborious ascent. Above, on the palace's main floors, courtiers maintained the illusion of normalcy. Diplomatic dispatches flew to and from foreign courts, carrying news of William's steadily improving health. The letters, penned in his distinctive script, were actually drafted by the Chancellor's clerks, who copied from aged samples of his handwriting. Ambassadors in Paris, The Hague and Vienna received perfumed missives declaring William's swift recovery. At ceremonial gatehouses, a man of similar build draped in royal crimson stood in for the king, lifting a gloved hand in regal greeting. The sudden sight of William, his figure unbowed atop a dais, reassured the London populace that all was well. Yet those who watched closely saw that he never lingered, that the pale illumination beneath his collar revealed cheeks more hollow than a mask. Paintings and portraits took on a memorial quality. Artists were summoned not to flatter the king's mien, but to capture his fading image for posterity. Brushes hovered to sketch his gaunt jawline, the hollows beneath his eyes, the slight slump of his shoulders. These studies, circulated among trusted nobles, formed a visual testament to his final state. Mirrors in the hallways were draped with silken cloth, lest they reflect the hollowed reflection of the monarch, a gesture meant not for mourning but for preserving dignity. Servants slipped through corridors in muted footfalls, their faces drawn in grief, knowing that no amount of ceremony could disguise the truth. William no longer possessed the strength to rule. In the silent nights, only the distant tolling of Big Ben, its peals carrying over the Thames, reminded Londoners that time pressed on beyond their sorrow. Beneath those resonant chimes, Kensington's keepers applied poultices of rosemary and juniper to cool the king's brow. They fed him tiny sips of mulled wine laced with honey and clove, hoping to revive his appetite. But William, his spirit entwined with his suffering, refused to break the cycle of pain. He pressed his trembling hand against the silken sheets and whispered, "I will not cede this body to weakness." His words, though firm, dissolved in the night air like mist. As the final morning of his life approached, the palace's facade of calm grew ever more brittle. The body double remained at the window, standing stiffly as foreign dignitaries passed below in carriages draped with black crepe. Inside the Blue Room, Gibson's final entry recorded a pulse so faint it could be mistaken for silence. The breath emerges and recedes, each inhalation a victory, each exhalation a farewell. Lady Jane Churchill, assigned as Lady of the Bedchamber, pressed her ear to the door, and heard only the soft rattle of dust upon fallen feathers and the ghost of a man's desperate will. And then, as dawn broke on that sombre dawn, William III drew his last breath. It was not with a trumpet's fanfare or a cannon's roar, but with the gentle cessation of a wheezing sigh, a truce between a king and his body at last. Outside, the yellow moon faded in the pale blue sky, and Kensington's gates opened to admit the first light of a world that William helped shape. Now poised to remember him not merely as conqueror of kings, but as a man who battled helplessness and limped on duty's path until his final hour. On the 7th night, spilling into the 8th day of March in the year 1702, A fierce tempest swept across London. Wind howled through chimney stacks, rattling shutters, and lightning rent the sky in blinding flashes. By the time dawn's pale light crept over the city, the Blue Room lay unnaturally still. William III, sovereign of England, Scotland, and Ireland, had finally drawn his last breath. For 2 days, the court held the news close, draping corridors and hush-hushed hallways in secrecy. It was not until the 10th of March that the kingdom officially announced the king's departure from this world, and even then, they chose words of gentle parting. His Majesty has bid the realm farewell in quiet repose. Immediately, the machinery of state swung into motion to shape public perception. In the dim back chambers of Kensington, physicians and scribes were ordered to destroy hospital records and expunge details of the collarbone infection. Medical journals that chronicled his decline were locked away or quietly burned. Official correspondence letters bearing William's distinctive signature was recopied to omit any mention of prolonged suffering. Foreign envoys in Paris, The Hague, and Vienna received elegantly scented dispatches declaring the king's peaceful passing, arranged so that no one suspected the weeks of fevered delirium he endured. On the 12th of March, the nation witnessed a grand state funeral orchestrated down to the last drumbeat. Cavalry regiments in resplendent crimson cloaks thundered past Westminster Hall, their hooves clattering on cobblestones, slick with March rains. The king's coffin, sheathed in deep crimson velvet and bound with silver clasps, rested upon a raised bier, draped in the royal standard. From the Guildhall to the Palace of Whitehall, church bells tolled in measured solemnity. Citizens gathered in small clusters, muffling sobs beneath their lace veils, and some dared to wonder aloud, is that truly William III beneath the glass canopy, or a likeness crafted by artisans to masquerade a tragic truth? Yet the true contest for power commenced even before the echoes of the funeral drums had faded. William had left no son to inherit his crowns. The royal succession passed to Anne, his sister-in-law, and the younger sister of Mary II. Anne, once a companion in courtly grief, now faced the daunting mantle of monarchy. The Privy Council scrambled to reforge alliances forged by William, drafting new treaties with the Dutch, reinforcing pacts with Hanover, and courting Parliament's favour to confirm Anne's right. Meanwhile, across Europe, diplomats speculated in salon whispers, would Anne uphold her brother's Protestant legacy, or would she bend to the pressures of faction and faith? The corridors of power quivered with both hope and uncertainty. At the same time, the medical community stepped into the light, transforming the king's suffering into a landmark case study. Physicians, once sworn to secrecy, began to circulate accounts of William's final illness. Congestive heart failure triggered by relentless fevers, pneumonia seeded by the infected collarbone fracture, renal decline from years of gout and bloodletting. Dr. Thomas Gibson's hidden journals detailing the autopsy dissection of kingly lungs, heart, liver, and kidneys were meticulously copied and shared among fellows of the Royal Society. In lecture halls from Oxford to Leiden, his notes ignited debate. No longer would medicine rely solely on ancient humours and prayer, but on direct observation, empirical dissection, and recorded symptoms. William's posthumous status as the most thoroughly examined patient of the 17th century marked a turning point for Western medicine, steering it away from mystical remedies toward the rigours of scientific inquiry. Culturally, the slow, deliberate passing of William III eroded the myth of an invincible monarch. In public monuments and oil paintings, he remained the youthful conqueror poised on horseback, sword aloft, yet whispers of his frailty could not be silenced. The populace, accustomed to tales of war and glory, now remembered a ruler who trembled in pain, who coughed blood into a handkerchief, whose final days were spent in delirium. Writers and pamphleteers seized upon this fragile duality, crafting elegies that spoke of the king's valour yet admitted the inevitability of human decay. Sculptors carved funerary reliefs showing a crown slipping from a skeletal hand, a quiet tribute to the union of power and mortality. In the hushed aftermath of his funeral, Westminster Abbey's nave bore witness not just to grief, but to a collective awakening. The throne could not shield a man from time's decay. Pomp and pageantry could not stave off the humbling truth of birth, illness, and death. The silent corridors of Kensington, once echoing with strategies of state, now resonated with the memory of a king's solitary struggle. And as Londoners resumed their daily routines, shops reopening, coaches rattling on narrow lanes, children skipping past Westminster gates, they carried with them a new understanding. The illusion of unassailable rule had been shattered softly, not by cannon or rebellion, but by the inexorable, silent rule of flesh and bone. Thus, William III's legacy endured as both a testament to achievement and a cautionary whisper against the arrogance of power. Even the most storied crowns must one day yield to the gentle tyranny of life's final breath. After the state funeral's grand spectacle, one might have believed William III's story had reached its poignant finale. Yet in truth, a new chapter began. The battle beyond the grave. Deep within the damp corridors of Kensington Palace's Blue Room, skilled embalmers were summoned under strict secrecy. They carried fine salts, harvested from Arabian deserts, and perfumed resins brought from Egyptian bazaars, substances thought to arrest decay and mask the scent of dissolution. In the flickering glow of lanterns, they laid the king's body upon a marble slab, its collarbones and pelvis gently realigned to mimic a peaceful slumber. His ribcage was padded to appear full, as though each breath might yet stir those once commanding lungs. All medical records, every fever chart, every swelling noted by Dr. Thomas Gibson were locked away in ebony chests, while only a single internal dossier remained. A stark chronicle of sclerotic lungs mottled with pus, a heart thickened with layers of strain, a liver swollen beyond its bounds, and shrunken kidneys riddled with the stones of gout. These confidential observations rippled quietly into the archives of the Royal Society in London, where they became treasured source material, propelling the fledgling science of pathology toward modern form. Meanwhile, as physicians pored over William's post-mortem findings, debating whether sepsis had taken root faster than any known fever, news of the king's embalming and anatomical revelations seeped into the public consciousness, eroding the once unshakable mystique of monarchy. In the hushed chambers of Westminster and Whitehall, members of Parliament, emboldened by whispers of concealment and mistrust, began to question the broader implications. If His Majesty could pretend health, what other truths lie hidden beneath gilded curtains? Heated debates unfolded over the limits of royal prerogative and the necessity of parliamentary oversight. Across Europe, the great powers England, the Dutch Republic, Prussia and France tuned their diplomatic instruments to a new pitch. Envoys in Brussels and The Hague watched for signs of Anne's political fidelity. Would she uphold the anti-French alliances meticulously crafted by her predecessor, or would she yield to the overtures of Versailles? In royal courts from Berlin to Paris, strategists measured the shifting balance, ready to recalibrate treaties and treaties of commerce as Anne ascended to the throne. But the seismic tremors did not stop at politics. They reverberated through the veins of culture itself. Painters turned away from gilded idealism to embrace a graver realism. Portraits now bore witness to every line etched by grief and every wrinkle carved by sleepless vigils. Viewers of history books began to savor accounts of William's final struggle. His ragged coughs, his spitting of blood, his fevered delirium more than the grandeur of his youthful victories. The newspapers of London, long content with polished dispatches of battle and diplomacy, inaugurated a new genre, meticulous medical reporting. Periodicals published detailed timelines of symptoms, from the first chills at Hampton Court to the catastrophic fall from Sorrel, the sorrel mare, and readers lingered over each entry as though tracing the arc of a tragic novel. Learned journals in Edinburgh and Leiden ran essays comparing William's case to classical accounts of emperors felled by illness, establishing conventions for case studies that would become the bedrock of evidence-based medicine. Simultaneously, coffeehouses, a crucible of intellectual ferment, buzzed with discussion of therapeutic failures. Patrons debated whether the leeching practices of their grandfathers might soon give way to microscopic study of blood and tissue. Anatomy theatres, once the domain of radical reformers, flourished under newfound respectability. Students of medicine flocked to see lectures on gangrenous wounds and pulmonary effusions, all illuminated by William's dramatic demise. The simple act of recording a patient's temperature and pulse, once a practice mired in superstition, now carried the weight of royal endorsement. Thus, from the king's hidden suffering, emerged a collective resolve that medicine must ground itself in observation, dissection, and rigorous documentation, rather than in prayers or charlatan cruelties. In the quiet aftermath, the people of London and of Europe at large found themselves united by a common revelation. The crowned figure, once believed untouchable by time's decay, was, in fact, as mortal as any subject. The sight of that resonant casket draped in velvet, the echoes of solemn drums, and the subtle stains of embalming oils became more monumental in memory than any battlefield triumph. And so, the silent struggle waged in the hidden chambers of Kensington did not merely preserve a corpse, it dismantled the myth of invincible rule. The legacy of William III thus endures in two intertwined threads, one of political evolution, as Parliament asserted its rightful gaze upon royal conduct, and one of medical revolution, as physicians embraced a more empirical understanding of the human body. Both sprang from that hush of death, that pivot from spectacle to reality, reminding us that power may wear the crown, but it cannot outwit the inexorable laws of life, illness, and eventual repose. The most profound consequence of William III's passing was the steady transfer of power from the person of the monarch into the hands of Parliament. His successor, Anne's sister of the late Queen Mary, ascended the throne not as a triumphant sovereign but with a heart weighed by anxiety and the shadow of her brother-in-law's tragic end. On the day of her coronation in the year 1702, Westminster Hall felt unusually hushed. The rustle of silk, the soft coughs of lords and ladies, and the low murmurs of whispered concern filled the vaulted arches. Anne, clad in royal purple, understood keenly that the divine right once claimed by kings had been eroded. Parliament, emboldened by years of asserting its will, no longer bowed in unquestioning deference, and the populace, once awed by regal pageantry, now spoke with newfound confidence. Under Queen Anne's reign, the landmark statutes that William had championed, the Bill of Rights of 1689, among them, were enforced with a determined hand. These laws, which curtailed arbitrary royal power, now found real teeth. The sovereign could no longer levy taxes or suspend laws without parliamentary consent. Sessions of the Commons and Lords, once cloistered affairs attended only by the privileged, began to admit accredited reporters and foreign correspondents. The notion of closed council gave way to open debate, and pamphleteers circulated transcripts of speeches and votes. Though England had no single written constitution, its evolving conventions acted as one, binding king and subject in a tacit social contract. The court, too, became more inclusive. Rising among its invited guests were men of letters, physicians, legal minds, and merchants, representatives of the middle class, whose influence William's reign had quietly nurtured. Parallel to the political transformation, William's medical legacy flourished. The public hospitals of London St Thomas's and Guy's expanded with new operating theatres and anatomy lecture rooms. No longer forbidden by custom or edict, public dissections became integral to medical instruction. Students in white coats crowded in galleries overlooking stainless steel tables, observing cuts through muscle and sinew, tracing the pathologies first detailed in the king's post-mortem report. The hands that once laid William's embalmed corpse to rest now guided scalpels through cadavers, teaching future physicians the art of anatomy. Elsewhere, specialized chairs for observing urinary samples, an innovation prompted by William's own renal decline, found their way into hospital wards, offering early glimpses of clinical laboratory practice. Beyond the marble halls and lecture theatres, the legend of the Silent Palace endured in whispers among those who had served in the royal household. Family archives preserved letters that spoke of the frantic nights spent mending the king's funeral robes, of the secret warnings not to light too many candles lest the scent of decay betray them. One steward's granddaughter told of fine powder dabbed upon William's cheeks so that his corpse would look as though asleep rather than dead. Mirrors in the king's chamber were shrouded, not out of fear of ghosts, but to shield him from his own hollow eyes. These details, once confined to the inner sanctum of court gossip, became the fodder of urban legend, an eerie testament to an era when power's veneer could be kept pristine only by layers of artifice. And so, as Queen Anne settled into her reign, the echoes of William III's death continued to reshape the nation's fabric. The crown had lost an aura of absolute invulnerability. In its place grew a framework of laws and institutions that bound monarchs to the rule of law. In medical schools, the hushed awe once reserved for divine right shifted to curious fascination with the workings of flesh and bone. Among the people, tales of the midnight hush in Kensington's corridors lingered. a reminder that even the greatest power could be humbled by mortality. The years that followed would see parliaments flexing new authority, physicians unveiling the secrets of the human body, and the public forever altered by the memory of a king whose final breath dispelled the illusion of unassailable rule. With the sweeping shifts in politics and medicine following William III's death, European cultural life entered what might be called the age of waking realism. Royal households, once cloaked in gaudy splendor and mythic invulnerability, began to appear instead as sites of human frailty, heartbreak, and mortality. In London's playhouses, audiences first witnessed dramatizations of that fateful ride upon sorrel, and even a staged dissection reminiscent of the king's own post-mortem. The eruption of shock sent ripples through the public conscience. Theatregoers mulled over the sight of a monarch's fall and the stern spectacle of anatomical revelation, unsettled by the notion that robes and crowns could no longer obscure the flesh beneath. Artists, too, responded with what came to be known as medical romanticism, a movement that blended pathos with clinical precision. William Hogarth, known for his moralizing series, painted somber scenes of palace corridors lined with somber masks, capturing the echo of footsteps in empty hallways where only ghosts should tread. His contemporary, the painter Mary Cavendish, rendered watercolours of ivory-skinned courtiers draped in lace, their eyes haunted by secrets of disease and decay. These images, stark against the era's customary gilded portraiture, offered viewers a more intimate and disquieting vista of royalty. For once, portraiture ceased to idealize. Instead, it honored the wrinkles of worry, the hollowed cheeks of sleepless nights, and the tremor in a royal hand once unaccustomed to weakness. Meanwhile, Jonathan Swift's celebrated satire, Gulliver's Travels, included a pointed critique of courtly artifice. In the land of Laodicea, the ruler was served by courtiers who wielded false signatures and waxen doubles, an unmistakable jab at the England that had hidden William's infirmity behind portrait frames and forged letters. Swift's readers, coffeehouse habitués and country gentlemen alike, recognized the allegory at once, understanding it as both witty entertainment and a political admonition. His narrative suggested that a people governed by appearances would one day demand a truer vision of leadership, a call for accountability that resonated beyond the printed page. Philosophers of the age, John Locke and David Hume, among them seized upon these developments to refine their theories of governance. Locke, writing in his two treatises of government, argued that sovereign authority rested not in divine right but in the consent of the governed. He observed almost somberly, "When a monarch can conceal his infirmities, what greater truths might he conceal?" Hume, in his essays on human nature, examined the disjunction between public perception and private reality, noting how a crown of gold still rests upon a head of flesh, and the throne must bow to the laws of mortality. Together, their writings laid philosophical groundwork for constitutional monarchy and popular sovereignty, ideas that would echo through parliaments for centuries to come. In the realm of medicine, the ripple effect of William's demise was equally profound. Physicians began formalizing the notion of the case study, meticulously documenting patient histories, symptom progressions, and treatment outcomes. No longer reliant on obscure humoral theories alone, they compared notes: the sweats of malaria, the eruptions of smallpox, the signs of gout now linked to renal compromise. Simple tallies of fever episodes and mortality rates led to the first crude surveys, proto-epidemiological inquiries into which diseases struck hardest, at which seasons, and which remedies offered greatest relief. These comparisons, once casual and anecdotal, acquired statistical rigor: flecks of blood in expectorations, precise measurements of fluid intake, counts of leeches applied. Such empirical methods gradually replaced the incantations of astrologers and the superstitions of rural healers. In medical schools at Oxford and Leiden, anatomy theatres filled with eager students. They recited passages from Latin treatises, while Dr. William Cheselden and his peers demonstrated how the king's lung tissue had been scarred by repeated infections. The very table upon which William's body had once lain became a pedagogical altar, sanctified not by prayer but by knowledge. Dissection, long banned as sacrilegious, emerged as a moral imperative. Only by confronting the realities of disease and death could practitioners hope to alleviate suffering. The public, too, grew accustomed to reading about medical conditions in newly established journals, where case studies carried the weight of evidence rather than legend. Thus, in the somber hush that followed a king's final breathing, Europe found itself awakening from an age of mythic certainty into a world shaped by verite and inquiry. The dramatic fall from Sorrel's back, the humble confession of a body that could no longer lie unbroken beneath velvet and gold, became emblematic of a broader cultural metamorphosis. Royal courts adapted to public scrutiny, art and literature embraced human imperfection, philosophy redefined political legitimacy, and medicine began its march toward modern science. In this new dawn, the recognition of mortality did not diminish the idea of leadership, but rather enriched it with honesty, compassion, and a shared understanding that all men and women, crowned or humble, must one day bow to the gentle, inescapable rhythms of breath and stillness. The legacy of William III helped crystallize the concept of a monarchy in transition, a crown no longer wielded with absolute authority, but exercised in partnership with democratic institutions. In the years following his death, his successor Anne, and later George I and George II, governed within a framework that balanced royal prerogative against parliamentary oversight. Under Anne's reign, ministers were chosen not merely by court favour, but by the confidence of the Commons. When George I, in the year 1704, ascended the throne as the first Hanoverian king, he brought with him a habit of consulting his ministers in cabinet councils, an arrangement that was further formalised under his son, George II. These early Georgian monarchs set the precedent that the sovereign's role would be to accede to laws passed by Parliament rather than to impose them at will. Thus began the evolution of the British model of constitutional monarchy, a system that, while preserving regal ceremony, placed genuine legislative authority in the hands of duly elected representatives. Parliament itself asserted its new strength through landmark statutes. The Bill of Rights of 1689, initiated during William's lifetime, was rigorously upheld. In the year 1716, the Septennial Act extended the maximum duration of Parliament from 3 years to 7, providing stability but also ensuring regular accountability to voters. Then, in the year 1728, the Regency Act was passed to provide for the continuance of government in the event of a monarch's minority or incapacity, thereby circumscribing the potential for power vacuums or autocratic rule. Financial authority also shifted. The civil list, once the lion's share of royal revenue, came under strict parliamentary review. No longer could the king unilaterally pledge crown lands or levy taxes on the populace. Every expenditure required appropriation by statute. This system of checks and balances created what contemporaries called a softer crown, one that reigned in harmony with the people's elected voice rather than above it. But William III's influence extended beyond constitutional mechanics into the very way society confronted the reality of mortality. The spectacle of his protracted struggle and silent funeral dispelled the custom of curt, perfunctory obsequies. Instead, funerary rites became deliberate occasions of public instruction and communal mourning. City councils in London, York, and Norwich organised civic funerals with sermons emphasising the inevitability of death and the moral duties of the living. In the countryside, parishioners gathered in churchyards for outdoor commemorations, complete with readings from Ecclesiastes and quiet meditations on the fragility of flesh. These practices marked a shift from concealing death within family vaults to acknowledging it as a universal experience that bound all social classes. From this cultural awakening sprang charitable initiatives that reflected a burgeoning sense of civic responsibility. The mid-18th century saw the creation of burial societies for the destitute, ensuring that even the poorest might rest beneath consecrated ground, rather than in mass paupers' pits. In the year 1774, the Royal Humane Society was founded not as a hospital or a church guild, but as a body dedicated to preserving life. It issued medals and premiums for the timely rescue of drowning victims, acknowledging that human agency could triumph over the randomness of tragedy. Meanwhile, street cries of privilege versus poverty inspired local benevolent societies to erect public coffins and maintain burial grounds, blending practical care with moral instruction. These associations underscored a new humanitarian philosophy, that no matter the grandeur of station, every man and woman shared in the cycle of birth, decay, and death. Moreover, the sober recognition of human frailty influenced literature and the arts. Poets composed elegies that dwelt not on the glories of the powerful, but on the ephemerality of life. Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, penned in the year 1776, echoed the idea that full many a flower is born to blush unseen, a sentiment born from the long shadow. William's passing cast over notions of status and remembrance. Similarly, painters began to depict funerary tableaux in parish churches, complete with humble villagers weeping by common graves, rather than adorning their canvases solely with triumphant battle scenes or opulent courtly banquets. Across all classes, conversations in taverns, drawing rooms, and assembly halls reflected a dawning understanding that the mantle of authority does not confer exemption from the decrees of nature. Gentlemen discussed the moral imperative to leave behind endowments for hospitals. Families drafted their wills with greater mindfulness of provisions for widows, children, and servants. Physicians, building upon the pathological studies ignited by William's case, turned their attention to preventative care and public health. They promoted cleanliness in towns, the draining of marshes to combat malaria, and the improvement of ventilation in existing infirmaries, tiny steps born of humbler recognition that health and life required communal stewardship. In these manifold ways, the legacy of William III extended far beyond his crown and his battlefield triumphs. His slow public demise at Kensington Palace did more than unsettle the myth of royal invincibility. It launched Britain, and by example, much of Europe onto a path toward constitutional restraint, medical enlightenment, and civic compassion. By embracing the reality of mortality, society learned to cherish life itself, to balance ceremony with scrutiny, to temper authority with accountability, and to honor every human journey from cradle to grave. And so, even as you drift toward sleep, consider that the true measure of power lies not in unchallenged dominion, but in the humble acknowledgement of our shared, inevitable fate. At last, the legacy of William III rests in two entwined narratives: the official history that celebrates him as the Protestant hero who toppled a Catholic regime, and the shadowed annals that chronicle a life marked by chronic illness, whispered fears, and courtly deception. In the grand halls of the Archives Nationales in Paris and the National Archives in London, scholars pore over ciphers, medical journals, and the private memoirs of palace servants, tangible proof of that silent palace, where courtiers whispered of fevered nights, of body doubles, and of forged dispatches. Letters penned in invisible ink, Dr. Thomas Gibson's meticulously dated fever charts, and the tear-stained recollections of Lord Portland together paint an intimate portrait of a monarch whose public myth diverged sharply from his private agony. Central to this dual narrative is the innocuous molehill at Hampton Court. Today, that rise of earth is nothing more than a tuft of grass and moss in a sprawling lawn, unnoticed by most visitors. Yet for those who know William's tale, it stands as a potent emblem of nature's subtle power, how a blind creature's tunnel, frozen by winter's grip, could unsettle a king's horse, shatter a brittle collarbone, and open the gateway to infection. This small bump, trivial in size, became the pivot upon which empire and fate turned. It is a reminder that mightiest crowns sit atop flesh that remains vulnerable to the most mundane forces of the physical world. From that singular event, we derive a broader lesson. History is not only inscribed by grand battles and sweeping reforms, but also by minute details: a small stone in a stirrup, a cracked bone, a single breach in the barrier of royal dignity. In the wake of William's passing, his suffering served as the cornerstone for modern pathology. Doctors dissected his embalmed remains, comparing organ lesions and vascular damage in ways never before sanctioned. Their findings were circulated among burgeoning medical societies, seeding methodologies that would evolve into systematic case reporting, clinical trials, and the critical underpinnings of modern medical education. Politically, William's slow decline catalyzed the shift from absolute sovereignty toward constitutional restraint. His public persona, once the instrument of divine right, became indistinguishable from a private man tormented by frailty. Parliaments, remembering his protracted illness and the spectacle of courtroom doubles, asserted their authority with new vigor. Successive laws, such as the Septennial Act and Regency Act, institutionalized checks on monarchical power, embedding the principle that rulers govern by law, not by whim. Thus, from the unraveling of a hidden truth in a palace chamber, emerged a system of governance that balanced tradition with accountability, tempering regal pomp with the rule of law. Socially, the awareness of mortality that permeated William's final days prompted deeper reflections on the rituals of death. Funerary practices transformed from secrets kept within nobility's vaults into public acts of remembrance and instruction. Community coffins, charitable burial societies, and humane rescue institutes like the Royal Humane Society arose from the same impulse, to recognize that all lives, regardless of station, meet the same end and deserve dignity in passing. Culturally, the tale of William's demise resonated across Europe's salons and playhouses. Writers and philosophers Locke, Hume, and Swift echoed the paradox of crowned flesh in their essays and satires. Artists replaced gleaming idealism with raw depictions of human decay. In theatre, audiences gasped at reconstructions of the king's fall and post-mortem examinations, clarifying that drama need not shy from the somber realities of existence. Today, as we tread the manicured grounds of Hampton Court or leaf through digitized ledgers in national archives, we engage with that living echo. The molehill that brought a monarch low, the chamber where resins and salts masked the scent of death, the pages that record every fever, every trembling hand, every faint pulse that once signaled a sovereign's life. The story persists as a soft murmur across centuries, reminding us that whoever we are, royal or ordinary power, does not confer immunity from the laws that govern all living things. In every breath we draw, and every bone that mends or fractures, lies the same vulnerability that felled William III, and in that shared fragility we find not only humility but also the truest measure of our common humanity. When the door of the Blue Room finally closed upon William III's final breath, Europe's political and diplomatic arenas did not pause for mourning. Instead, they launched their final campaign, a contest of whispers and ink across courts and embassies. Rumours of the allegedly immortal monarch's secret decline coursed through the channels of power. In Paris, ministers murmured that the Protestant alliance was unravelling. At Versailles, courtiers exhaled relief, believing the spectre of Orange dominance at last laid to rest. In Berlin and Vienna, Prussian and Austrian envoys sharpened their pens to renegotiate treaties, sensing the balance of power shifting. Even the Sun King, Louis XIV, is said to have dispatched spies into London who reported in cipher that William had indeed perished days before the official announcement, a detail that set salon tongues aflame with intrigue. At home in England, public confidence wavered between solemn grief and uneasy suspicion. Official bulletins declared that His Majesty rests in peaceful, eternal slumber, yet the capital's newspapers, those draped in black crepe and printed under dim candlelight, pressed questions of authenticity. Pamphlets circulated with woodcuts depicting the king's features drawn ashen and cracked beneath layers of white powder. Anonymous broadsheets claimed that a body double had been seen stepping from the coach at Kensington, imperceptibly imitating William's stately gait. Who truly guides the realm? Some editorialists asked between paragraphs. The man in the casket or those who took his place? To quell such doubts, the new court of Queen Anne issued the Edict of Sealed Signatures, decreeing that all royal documents must bear a unique leaden seal. No longer would a scribe's signature suffice. Councillors were required to append their own handwriting alongside a personal fingerprint. Parliament complemented this measure by tightening oversight of secret warrants, mandating that ministers secure explicit consent from a quorum of members before issuing any decree shrouded in royal confidentiality. This marked a watershed in English jurisprudence. The cloak of royal secrecy, once absolute, now lay vulnerable beneath the lantern of public examination. Beyond the politicking, Europe's intellectual and artistic circles responded with a convergence of satire and solemnity. William Hogarth, with brush in sleepy hand, painted The Silent Funeral, a scene of funeral procession so hushed that even the marble statues along Whitehall seemed to bow their heads. In muted palettes, he rendered the pallbearers' faces gaunt and tired, the wreaths of laurel and lily pallid against the overcast sky. His canvas captured not a triumphant monarch's end, but the weary resignation of a country forced to reckon with a king's mortality. Jonathan Swift, in his nest of crowded manuscripts, elevated the subterfuge to allegory within the pages of Gulliver's Travels. In the realm of Lilliput, the ruler's death, or perhaps his very life, depended on hollow tokens and elaborate deceptions. a thinly veiled critique of the English crown's recent performance. His readers, nursing cups of foamy ale in warm taverns, smiled wryly at the notion that power might be nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, held aloft by courtiers adept at spin and mimicry. The broader currents of English literature shifted too. Where once poets lauded royal infallibility, now their verses trembled with empathy for human frailty. Elegies no longer exalted crowns but lamented broken bodies, and once proud limbs laid low by injury and illness. Playwrights, inspired by London's theatres of anatomy, wrote scenes in which surgeons peered into chests and bishops murmured prayers over opened coffers, blending medical precision with mournful tone. Audiences gasped at the spectacle, then slipped into thoughtful silence, as if waking from a long dream of unbroken authority. Across the Channel, German salons exchanged news of these artistic reckonings, while French pamphleteers weighed in on the moral lesson that no monarchy, no matter how divinely ordained, could remain invulnerable to the simplest twists of fate. Even the Jesuit colleges, wary of Protestant triumphalism, grappled with the undeniable spectacle of a king conquered by infection and lamed by a molehill's rise. In this posthumous skirmish for reputation and truth, William III's final act proved more instructive than any battlefield victory. His Death Theatre, enacted beneath vaulted ceilings and obscured by layers of official artifice, unveiled the brittle core of power. The edict of sealed signatures and parliamentary oversight became enduring legacies, no less impactful than the treaties he once negotiated. Hogarth's mournful brushstrokes and Swift's satirical barbs echoed through generations, reminding Europeans that the real measure of authority lies not in crowns or cannon, but in the honesty with which leaders face their own end. And so, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that night of March 8 in the year 1702, when wind shrieked through Westminster's eaves and the world held its breath. In the hush that followed, the true battle was not over land or faith, but over perception and authenticity. In the end, the lesson whispered across courts and coffee houses alike, that even the greatest throne cannot withstand the subtle forces of rumour, scepticism, and the human need for truth. In that gentle, unending war of whispers, power finds its ultimate check, not in armies or armies of law, but in the quiet insistence that every story, no matter how regal, must stand before the court of reality. Over the following decades, the image of William III, the ailing king, quietly took on the hue of a subterranean cultural emblem. No longer celebrated solely for his naval triumphs or the glorious revolution, he was remembered for the protracted battle within his own flesh, his chronic asthma, the relentless gout, and the fatal infection that crept through a fractured collarbone. In his second homeland of the Dutch Republic, a circle of Leiden scholars assembled a volume of decrypted correspondence and the Crown's secret journals, exposing the shadowy stratagems of the English court. Their publication, Codices Regii, offered unprecedented insight into the subterfuge and forged letters that masked William's decline. Across the Channel in London, the Royal Society released its Royal Case Studies, the first compendium devoted to a sovereign's medical record. Dr. Thomas Gibson's confidential notes fever charts scrawled in candlelight, organ assessments recorded with trembling precision became foundational documents for Europe's emergent pathology. Medical education flourished in the aftermath. Anatomy, once a tenuous topic of whispered controversy, became an indispensable pillar of training. Operating theatres, previously the exclusive adornment of palaces and esoteric guilds, opened their wrought-iron gates to eager medical apprentices. Under the stern gaze of professors, students learned to make precise incisions, mapping the very lesions that had condemned a king. They compared cases of pulmonary collapse from asthma with data on joint inflammation caused by gout, following the intricate interplay of comorbidities. Epidemiological inquiry found its first serious footing. Simple surveys tallied the seasonal peaks of asthma attacks, the distribution of gout in older men, and the occurrence of bone infections in patients with fractures. Early devices emerged from this fervour. Rudimentary stethoscopes, tubes of polished boxwood allowed physicians to listen for wheezes once inaudible. Powder inhalers dispensed fine sea salt mixtures laced with opium or eucalyptus, marking a distinct departure from reliance on poultices and unguents. The transformation extended from laboratories into London's theatres and coffee houses. Playwrights, seizing upon the public's newfound appetite for realism, penned The Kensington Dream, a tragedy staged in the candlelit gloom of a royal sick chamber. The audience watched, eyes dimmed by gaslight, as actors portrayed the sovereign racked by fever, calling out for Mary, brandishing imaginary swords at invisible adversaries. Tears trickled down pallid cheeks as viewers recognized the pathos of a king reduced to mortal suffering, a dramatic mirror to their own fragile lives. Meanwhile, journals such as the London Medical Observer printed a series entitled The Imperial Illness Legacy, dissecting William's misadventures in medicine. From pan-European pilgrimages to spas and thermal springs, undertaken in vain to soothe his lungs, to the excessive bloodletting sessions that may have hastened his decline. These articles served as cautionary tales, urging practitioners to question tradition and to favour careful observation over sweeping remedies. Even in the painted halls of the aristocracy, conversations turned to the lessons of William's end. Patrons at the opera whispered of the folly in exalting rulers above the laws of nature. Gentlewomen took to inscribing medical aphorisms, warnings against overdrawn phlebotomy, advices on gentle breathing exercises into the margins of courtly novels. The image of the Stoic monarch, once poised upon a marble pedestal, gave way to a new archetype, the ruler who, despite valour and lineage, succumbed to infirmity. And in that humanization, society found a profound kinship. If king and subject alike shared the vulnerability of the body, then compassion, rather than fear, might bind them. In quiet corners of universities, students of medicine recited the list of William's ailments as if invoking a litany. Asthma, gout, infection, fever, heart strain. Each term carried the weight of a life both exalted and diminished by circumstance. And yet, from that catalogue of suffering sprang the flowering of scientific rigour. Case histories piled into thick tomes, statistical tables aligned in careful columns, lectures illustrated with vivid diagrams. Young apprentices no longer trembled at the prospect of dissecting a cadaver. They approached each specimen with the sober purpose of preventing future tragedy. Across the continent, in Vienna's medical faculty and Paris's Hôtel Dieu professors cited the Leiden codices and the royal case studies as cornerstones of curriculum. Thus, William III's posthumous influence transcended dynastic lines. He became the patron saint of pathological inquiry and the unwitting pioneer of constitutional restraint. His story, rendered in scholarly publications and staged in smoky playhouses, reminded Europe that even the tallest towers of power stand on ground that is mortal and fallible. In the hush between heartbeat and hush of sleep, one might hear a whispered echo that in the end, the line between sovereign and subject is drawn not by blood or title but by the simple, universal dictates of body and breath. By the dawn of the 18th century, the legend of the Silent Palace had slipped from regal archives into the river of popular imagination, where its currents ran both wild and free. Among London's taverns and Amsterdam's canal-side inns, travellers and townsfolk exchanged whispered tales of the mysterious body double of William III. Patrons claimed to glimpse the figure on balcony ledges, draped in crimson robe, tilting an imaginary crown, only to discover on closer approach a motionless mannequin gazing listlessly over the Thames. In the bustling markets of Norwich and the quiet streets of Leiden, these rumours tickled the public mind. If the sovereign could be so deftly impersonated, if the throne itself could be propped by shadow and suspicion, then what indeed was the nature of power but a well-woven illusion? Meanwhile, the Church of England found itself embroiled in a theological reckoning. William's meticulously concealed final illness, and the hush that surrounded his funeral, provoked urgent debate on the nexus of faith and governance. The ecclesiastical council decreed that, henceforth, every royal obsequy must be overseen by a cadre of archbishops and bishops. They drafted the Royal Proclamation of Sacred Witness, a mandate requiring that clerics present at the monarch's final rites sign official affidavits attesting to the authenticity of the burial. Catholic prelates, still mistrusted since the days of William's rise, were explicitly barred from involvement. Sermons in cathedrals took on a sharper tone. Once extolling the divine right of kings, ministers now cautioned congregations that temporal rule remained accountable to heavenly judgment. The pulpit, long a bastion of uncritical praise, became a forum for sober reflection on the limits of earthly authority. As the memory of William's silent decay faded into the past, his successors bore the imprint of that mournful lesson. George I, who ascended the throne in the year 1704, made it his practice to greet subjects in St. James's Park, even when beset by gout or ailing with colds. Portrait painters were invited to capture his likeness, not in full regalia alone, but also in informal attire, brown frock coats and simple nightcaps, so that the public might see, plainly and unadorned, the face behind the crown. His son George II followed suit, consenting to be drawn reclining in Windsor's gardens, a cup of tea in one hand, spectacles perched upon his nose, each stroke of the artist's brush celebrating the human side of monarchy. By the middle of the 18th century, newspapers like the London Gazette and pamphleteers' journals published not only royal proclamations, but also candid vignettes of court life. The king's cough during Privy Council meetings, his preference for walking among peas in the royal greenhouses, and even the occasional weakness that prompted a morning's rest in his boudoir. No longer did the palace gates remain bolted against prying eyes. Journalists of the day obtained permissions reserved for those charged with painting the royal portrait to attend ceremonial processions, noting the sovereign's step, his laughter, and the very halos of hesitancy that occasionally crossed his brow. This shift toward openness served a dual purpose. Politically, it reaffirmed the principle that a monarch's authority derived not from divine mystery, but from the goodwill and consent of his people. Socially, it fostered an intimacy between ruler and subject, knitting loyalty through familiarity rather than fear. The friendly monarch became a staple of 18th century pamphlets. Kings depicted as benevolent uncles rather than unreachable demigods. Thus, a new monarchy emerged, one that balanced stately tradition with a transparency born of necessity. And so the tale of William III, the embattled, ailing king, ensnared by courtly deceit and ravaged by infection, transformed over generations into a cautionary legend. It reminded rulers and ruled alike that the splendour of the crown must be tempered by the reality of the body. In London's coffee houses, over mugs of claret, gentlemen mused that truth, however disguised, would surface in the end. Just as William's secret decay could no longer remain hidden behind velvet drapes. By the time the 18th century drew to a close, the silent palace and its spectral doubles had become emblematic of an era's awakening. From the hushed corridors of a dying king's chamber to the sunlit promenades of an open court, the monarchy learned to breathe alongside its people. And though no molehill or fractured bone could fully erase the memory of William's final days, his story lived on as a soft murmur in the annals of history, a lullaby warning that power, like life itself, must be laid bare to the light of day in order to endure. And so, dear listener, as the soft hush of night settles around us, and the last echoes of William III's tale gently fade into the darkened corners of memory, we can allow our minds to drift on a gentle current of reflection. In those final moments, when a king's breath grew faint and the heavy velvet curtains of Kensington fell quiet, we are reminded that no crown, however gleaming, can shield us from the tender vulnerabilities of our own humanity. It is in this shared frailty, this very natural truth, that we discover our deepest strength. Compassion for one another, the courage to face life's uncertainties, and the wisdom to cherish each fleeting moment we are given. Let the image of that silent palace, once pregnant with intrigue and fear, now dissolve like mist at dawn. Picture instead a field of pale moonlight, where every blade of grass sways in unison to the lullaby of a gentle breeze. Feel the weight of the day's worries lift from your shoulders, as though carried away on invisible currents, leaving only calm and quiet in their wake. In this space, we learn that even the grandest histories painted in battles, alliances, and royal decrees ultimately return to the simple rhythms of breath and soft sighs, of rest and renewal. The true message woven through William's story is not one of power or scandal, but of empathy and humility. When we look beyond the trappings of authority, we see the same tender heartbeats that bind us all. We learn that greatness need not be measured in conquests or edifices, but in kindness shown to others, in the gentle touch of understanding offered at life's most fragile moments. It teaches us that, in the end, our shared vulnerability is not a weakness to be hidden, but a gift to be honored, for it unites us across time and place. And so, Let your eyelids grow heavy with the realization that you, too, are part of this grand tapestry, a human story interlaced with laughter and tears, trials and triumphs. Tonight, as you nestle into your bed and feel the soft embrace of your blankets, remember that every breath is a quiet miracle, every heartbeat a testament to the perseverance of the human spirit. Close your eyes and allow the gentle rhythm of sleep to carry you into dreams where compassion reigns, and where the silent palace gives way to gardens of peace. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history's whispered corridors. If our stories bring you comfort and curiosity, please subscribe to our channel so that you may continue to drift with us into new tales, each one crafted to soothe your mind and enrich your heart. Until we meet again beneath the moon's soft glow, may you find rest in the promise of tomorrow and awaken refreshed by the dawn's first light. Good night and sweet dreams.